One small act of kindness in a crowded diner changed the lives of a struggling waitress, a wealthy father, and his disabled son forever. James Thornton was a man everyone in the city knew, at least by name. He was the owner of one of the largest companies in the country, a man whose face appeared on the covers of business magazines and whose name was spoken with admiration. In meetings and conferences, people often thought of him as cold and distant, a man who cared only about profits and investments. His life looked perfect from the outside: lavish parties, luxury cars, and private jets. But behind all of that, James was a father first. His heart belonged to his only child, Ethan. Ethan was born with cerebral palsy, and his condition meant that he needed extra care every single day. Unlike other children who could run, jump, and play freely, Ethan had to move with the help of a wheelchair. Even so, he had a bright smile and a curious mind that loved to explore new places. James had spent millions on treatments, therapy sessions, and medical equipment. But more than money, what Ethan really needed was time and attention. James tried his best, but his busy schedule often pulled him away from moments that mattered. He loved his son deeply, yet he struggled to balance his role as a billionaire businessman and as a single father. That Saturday afternoon, James decided to do something simple, something far from his usual life of boardrooms and hotels. He wanted to take Ethan out for lunch, not to a five-star restaurant where waiters bowed and menus carried impossible prices, but to a small diner he had heard about from one of his drivers. It was the kind of place ordinary families went, with the smell of fresh coffee and pies baking in the oven, where children laughed loudly and no one cared about appearances. For James, it was a chance to give Ethan a piece of normal life, a life that didn't revolve around hospitals or security guards. When they arrived, the bell above the diner door rang softly. Ethan's eyes lit up as he looked around. The place was cozy, with checkered tablecloths, a jukebox in the corner, and the warm chatter of people enjoying their meals. The smell of pancakes and fried chicken filled the air. For Ethan, who was used to silent dining rooms with polished silverware, this place felt alive and exciting. James pushed his wheelchair gently to a booth near the window where sunlight spilled across the table. James looked at his son and smiled. "What do you think, champ?" he asked. Ethan grinned. "I like it, Dad. It feels happy." Those simple words warmed James more than any business victory ever could. For a moment, he wasn't the billionaire everyone wanted something from. He was just a dad enjoying lunch with his boy. The waitress approached with a friendly smile, her notepad in hand. She had kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth. She bent slightly to Ethan's level, speaking to him first instead of James. "Hi there, sweetheart. What would you like to eat today?" Ethan, usually shy around strangers, surprised his father by answering right away. "Can I have pancakes with extra syrup?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. She laughed softly and wrote it down. "Pancakes with extra syrup, coming right up." "And for you, sir?" she asked James. He ordered something simple, still watching how easily Ethan had connected with her. For the next half hour, father and son enjoyed their time. James listened to Ethan talk about a cartoon he had watched, about how he wanted to learn more about planets and stars. James nodded, his chest tightening with both pride and guilt. Pride because Ethan's mind was so sharp and curious. Guilt because he realized how rarely he gave his son the space to simply talk and dream. He promised himself silently that he would do better, that he would make more time. As they ate, James's phone buzzed. Tried to ignore it, but the screen flashed with a call from one of his senior managers. It was about a major deal that couldn't wait. He sighed, picked it up, and turned slightly away so Ethan wouldn't feel ignored. His voice lowered as he discussed figures and strategies. He told himself it would take only a minute. But while James was on the phone, Ethan decided to be brave. He had noticed the dessert counter, where pies and cakes sat beautifully displayed. The boy loved sweets, and the thought of a slice of chocolate cake tempted him more than anything. Without saying a word, he began to move his wheelchair slowly, trying to reach it on his own. He wanted to surprise his father, maybe even pay with the small allowance James gave him sometimes. The diner floor was a little uneven, and the wheel of the chair caught against a ridge. Before Ethan could steady himself, the chair tilted. In one terrifying moment, he slid out and tumbled to the ground. The sound of his fall echoed across the diner, and several customers gasped. James's head snapped around, his heart leaping into his throat. He dropped his phone without even ending the call. But before he could reach his son, someone else was already there. It was the waitress. She rushed forward, kneeling beside Ethan with a speed and urgency that showed she wasn't just doing her job, she truly cared. She gently lifted Ethan into her arms, holding him close, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. You're not hurt, are you?" Her voice was steady, calming, the kind of tone that soothed fear instantly. Ethan's wide eyes filled with tears, but when he looked at her, he stopped crying. He clung to her hand as though she was the only safe person in that moment. James froze for a second, stunned by what he saw. He had bodyguards, assistants, doctors, yet none of them had ever shown this natural instinctive care. This young woman, a waitress he didn't even know, held his son like he was the most precious thing in the world. For James, the billionaire who thought he had seen everything, it was an image he could never forget. The fall happened so quickly that almost no one had time to react. 1 second, Ethan was moving his wheelchair with small, determined pushes toward the dessert counter, and the next second, the wheel hit the edge of a rug and the chair tipped. Forward, his small body slipped out, landing hard on the polished diner floor. A hush fell over the room. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died, and all eyes turned toward the little boy lying helplessly on the ground. James dropped his phone, immediately his heart thundering in his chest. For him, time seemed to slow. He saw his son's tiny hands flail, saw the shock and fear flash across his face. His legs refused to move for a brief moment, frozen by the kind of terror only a parent knows. The thought that Ethan might be hurt, even slightly, tore through him like a blade. Before James could take a single step, Sarah, the young waitress, was already at Ethan's side. She had been carrying a tray of glasses, but the moment she heard the crash, she abandoned everything and rushed to the boy. The glasses shattered behind her on the counter, but she didn't even glance back. She crouched on the floor beside Ethan, gently sliding her arms under his body. Her movements were quick, yet careful. The way someone moves when their only thought is to protect. Ethan whimpered, clutching his arm as though it hurt. His wheelchair lay on its side a few feet away. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his small frame trembled. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah whispered softly, holding him against her chest. "You're safe. I've got you. Nothing's going to happen." Her voice was warm, steady, filled with a kindness that wrapped around him like a blanket. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide, and slowly his cries quieted. By the time James reached them, Ethan's little hand was already gripping Sarah's uniform tightly. James knelt beside them, his voice breaking. "Ethan, are you all right? Did you hurt yourself?" He wanted to scoop his son into his arms, but Ethan turned his face into Sarah's shoulder, refusing to let go. That simple gesture struck James deeply. His son, who usually clung only to him, had chosen comfort in the arms of a stranger. The other customers began murmuring, their initial shock turning into whispers of concern. Some nodded approvingly at Sarah's quick reaction. Others offered napkins and tissues. But Sarah didn't pay attention to anyone else. Her focus was only on the fragile boy in her arms. She brushed a strand of hair off his forehead and asked gently, "Where does it hurt, honey? Tell me so I can help." Ethan sniffled and pointed to his elbow. Sarah examined it with the carefulness of someone who knew how to handle children. "It's just a small bump," she reassured him. "Nothing broken. You're very brave." She smiled at him, and to everyone's surprise, including James. Ethan smiled faintly back. James felt a storm of emotions inside him, fear still, gripped his chest, but alongside it came something unexpected: gratitude. Gratitude toward this young woman who had acted faster than he had, who had offered his son the kind of comfort even money couldn't buy. He noticed the way Ethan's small fingers refused to release her, as if he trusted her completely after. Only a few moments. The manager of the diner rushed over, apologizing to James for the incident, offering free meals, asking if they needed an ambulance. But James barely heard him. His eyes stayed on Sarah and Ethan. For years, he'd employed the best nurses and caregivers, all highly trained and well paid, yet he had never seen Ethan connect with anyone so quickly. Ethan was often shy, hesitant with new people, but with Sarah, there was no fear, only trust. When Sarah tried to set him down gently back into his wheelchair, Ethan shook his head, his arms tightening around her neck. "Stay," he whispered softly. She looked up at James, almost as if asking permission. James, still stunned, nodded slowly. "It's all right," he said, his voice lower than usual. She carried Ethan carefully back to their booth and sat beside him, keeping her arm around his shoulders until he calmed fully. She told him little stories in a soothing tone about how she used to trip and fall when she was small, how sometimes clumsy moments turned into funny memories. Ethan chuckled, his fear melting away. James sat across the table, watching in silence, every second making him more curious about this waitress who had stepped into their lives so unexpectedly as Ethan relaxed. Sarah finally glanced at James. "He's okay," she assured him. "It was a scary fall, but he's strong. He just needed a hug." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that reached straight into James's heart. For so long, he had believed the best protection for Ethan came in the form of expensive treatments and constant medical supervision. Yet here was a stranger, showing him that sometimes what a child needed most was not medicine, but tenderness. James tried to thank her, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't a man who struggled with speeches. He had convinced entire rooms of investors, swayed politicians, and inspired employees by the thousands. But in front of this young woman holding his son, he could only manage a quiet "thank you. Thank you so much." Sarah shook her head with a gentle smile. "You don't have to thank me. He's a wonderful boy. Anyone would have done the same." But deep down, James knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have dropped everything and rushed forward. Not everyone would have held Ethan with such tenderness, spoken to him as though he were her own, calmed him so quickly. The rest of the diner slowly returned to normal, though many customers kept stealing glances at the little family in the corner. Some smiled, touched by the scene they had just witnessed. James remained quiet, lost in thought, his gaze shifting between Ethan, who still leaned against Sarah, and Sarah herself, who didn't seem bothered by the extra time she was spending at their table. That moment carved itself into James's heart. For years he had felt the weight of being the only one Ethan could truly depend on. He worried about what would happen when he wasn't there, who would understand his boy's needs, who would comfort him when life felt too heavy. Now, for the first time, he saw someone else step into that role as naturally as breathing. Accident, though frightening, had opened a window James never expected. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way Ethan's face softened in Sarah's arms, about the trust that had sparked instantly. James realized this was not just a small event in a diner. This was the beginning of something that might change all of their lives. James sat there quietly, his phone forgotten on the table, his mind still trying to process what he had just witnessed. He had seen his son fall many times before. Every fall had been painful to watch, and each time he had been the one to rush forward to pick him up, to reassure him. But today was different. Today someone else had been faster. Someone else had been the one Ethan turned to. And not just anyone, a waitress he had never met before. The diner had settled back into its usual rhythm. Plates clattered, voices rose and fell, and the smell of frying bacon filled the air again. But at their table, something had changed. Ethan still sat close to Sarah, his hand wrapped around hers, as though letting go might mean losing the comfort he had just found. He wasn't crying anymore. Instead, he was smiling shyly at her, asking her little questions about her life in the curious way children often do. "Do you work here every day?" Ethan asked softly. "Almost," Sarah replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Work mornings, afternoons, and sometimes even nights." "That's a lot," Ethan said, his voice full of wonder. "Don't you get tired?" She laughed gently. "I do, but I'm strong, and I have to keep working hard. My family depends on me." James listened closely, pretending to look out the window, but every word stayed with him. He noticed how Sarah, didn't complain, how her tone carried pride instead of bitterness. He also noticed how comfortable Ethan was, talking to her like he had known her for years. Normally, Ethan was cautious with strangers, often hiding behind his father when anyone tried to start a conversation. But with Sarah, he was open, curious, and full of life. James leaned forward slightly, unable to resist joining the conversation. "How old are you, Sarah?" he asked. 23, she said politely, though she didn't look directly at him. Her focus stayed on Ethan. "I'm studying nursing, but I work here to pay my tuition and help my younger siblings." "You're in nursing school?" James asked, raising his eyebrows. "Yes," she said with a small smile. "I want to become a pediatric nurse. Kids have always been my favorite. You're brave, even when life is hard for them." Her words hit James like a quiet revelation. Here was a young woman working long hours in a diner, dreaming of helping children, and there sat his own child, looking at her as though she were the most interesting person in the world. Ethan tugged her hand. "Again, do you know about space?" he asked eagerly. "I like stars. I want to learn all their names." Sarah's face lit up. "Love stars too." "Did you know the biggest star is so huge that our sun looks tiny next to it?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? Which one is it?" "It's called Uiscuddy," she explained, pronouncing it carefully so he could repeat it. "It's so big that if it were in our solar system, it would swallow all the planets, even Jupiter." James was astonished. Not only had she comforted his son, but now she was teaching him something new, sparking his curiosity. It was the kind of conversation James wished he had more time for. His work often kept him distracted, and when he was home, exhaustion weighed him down. He gave Ethan everything money could buy: tutors, therapists, doctors, but he couldn't give him what Sarah had offered in just a few minutes. Connection. James studied her more closely now. Her uniform was clean but worn, her shoes slightly scuffed from long shifts. There were faint circles under her eyes, signs of sleepless nights, and yet she carried herself with energy and grace. She smiled icily, and when she looked at Ethan, her whole face softened. She wasn't pretending. There was no act, no forced politeness. She truly cared. After a while, Sarah stood, reluctantly pulling her hand free. "I should get back to work," she said kindly. "Other tables need me too." But Ethan clung to her sleeve. "Don't go," he pleaded. Sarah knelt down again, her eyes level with his. "I'll come back to check on you, I promise. But you have to be brave while I help the others, okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, though his grip loosened reluctantly. James watched this small exchange with amazement. His son had never begged for anyone to stay before, not even with his teachers or therapists. This bond was different, special. It had formed in the span of minutes. When Sarah walked away, James finally exhaled as though he had been holding his breath the entire time. He looked at Ethan, who was still watching her move from table to table. "You like her, don't you?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "She makes me feel safe." Those words pierced James's heart. Safe. He had spent years trying to build a world of safety for his sun guards at the house. Top hospitals, private schools, and yet safety, real safety, had been found in the arms of a stranger in a diner. For the rest of the meal, James couldn't take his eyes off Sarah. He noticed how she balanced trays effortlessly, how she remembered every customer's order, how she smiled even when people were impatient. She carried herself with quiet dignity, never showing frustration, never letting her exhaustion slip through. James realized she wasn't just hard-working, she was extraordinary. When the meal ended, Sarah brought them the check. She placed it on the table with her usual warm smile. "I hope you both enjoyed your meal," she said. James handed her his card, but hesitated before speaking. "Thank you again for earlier. You really helped my son." Sarah shrugged lightly. "It was nothing." But James shook his head. "It wasn't nothing. To me, it meant everything." His voice was quiet, but the sincerity in it made Sarah pause. She looked at him for the first time directly, her eyes meeting his. There was no awe in her gaze, no recognition that he was a billionaire. She didn't see the businessman the world Admired, she saw only a father in his son. And that, James realized, was rare. As they left the diner, Ethan waved at Sarah with a bright smile. "Bye, Sarah. I'll come back," he called out. Sarah waved back, her smile just as wide. "Be here." James pushed Ethan's wheelchair toward the car, but his thoughts were far away. He couldn't forget the image of Sarah holding his son, or the way Ethan had laughed with her. Something inside him told him this was not the end of their story. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, James sat in his study, staring at the city lights through the tall glass windows. His mind returned again and again to Sarah the waitress, who worked double shifts, the young woman with dreams of becoming a nurse. The stranger who had comforted his son like no one else ever had. He thought about how quickly Ethan had trusted her, how she had spoken to him as though he mattered, not as though he was fragile or broken. James realized that for the first time in a long while, he had seen his son light up in a way that no therapist, no tutor, no expensive professional had ever managed. And as much as James tried to push the thought aside, a quiet certainty grew. Inside him, this meeting had not been an accident. It had been fate. James couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his enormous bed, the sheets smooth and cold, the silence of the mansion pressing in on him. Normally, exhaustion from long hours at the office carried him quickly into dreamless rest, but not this time. His thoughts spun in circles, replaying the scene at the diner again and again. Ethan's fall. Sarah rushing forward, the way his son clung to her as though she had been a part of his life forever. Could still hear Ethan's small voice, saying, "She makes me feel safe." Those words echoed louder than anything else. The next morning, James went into his office but couldn't focus on his meetings. The polished boardroom table, the charts on the screen, the endless voices of executives discussing profits, it all felt distant. His mind wandered back to Sarah. He remembered her tired eyes that still carried kindness, the way she had smiled. Through exhaustion, the way she had spoken about her family with quiet strength. For a man who had built his life on numbers and strategies, James found himself thinking about something entirely new. A waitress who worked double shifts and yet carried more dignity than most of the billionaires he knew, by the end of the day. James made a decision. He wanted to know more about her, not out of suspicion, but because something in his heart told him this young woman was special. He called one of his trusted aides, someone who had worked with him for years and understood his need for privacy. "Her name is Sarah," James said. "She works at a small diner downtown. I want to know about her background, her life. Everything, quietly." Within days, the information arrived. Sarah lived in a modest apartment in an older building. She had 2 younger siblings, both still in school, and a mother who was recovering from a serious illness. Their father had left years ago, leaving Sarah to shoulder most of the responsibility. She worked long shifts to keep rent paid, food on the table, and her siblings in school. At the same time, she attended nursing classes, determined not to give up on her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse. The bills often piled higher than her paycheck, and some months she had to choose between paying rent on time or buying medicine for her mother. James read all of this slowly, his chest tightening with every word. He thought of the luxury he lived in, the endless wealth at his disposal, and then of Sarah, who worked until her feet ached just to keep her family safe. Yet when he had met her, she hadn't looked defeated. She had looked strong, hopeful, even cheerful. He admired her resilience, but more than that, admired her heart. The next weekend, James returned to the diner with Ethan. As soon as they walked in, Ethan's face lit up. "Sarah," called out excitedly, waving both arms. Sarah turned, her face breaking into a smile as she hurried over. She crouched down beside Ethan. "Hey, champ," she said warmly. "I was hoping I'd see you again." Ethan reached out for her hand without hesitation. She gave it gladly. They ate together again, and James watched closely. Sarah talked to Ethan about school, about his favorite cartoons, about the stars he loved so much. She laughed at his jokes, encouraged his questions, and never once treated him as fragile. James felt something shift inside him. He had spent years surrounding Ethan with professionals, therapists, doctors, teachers, yet none of them had ever given his son this simple joy. After the meal, James asked if Sarah could sit with them. For a few minutes, she hesitated, glancing around the busy diner, but her manager nodded from the counter, downed, and she slid into the booth beside Ethan. "I wanted to thank you again," James began, his voice calm but serious. "You've been so kind to my son. He hasn't stopped talking about you all week." Sarah blushed lightly, shaking her head. "He's a wonderful boy. Honestly, I enjoy talking to him. He's smart and curious. Doesn't feel like work, it feels like fun." James leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "I know you work hard. I also know it can't be easy, balancing everything you do. I'd like to make you an offer." Sarah looked startled. "An offer?" "Yes," James said firmly. "I want you to become Ethan's personal caregiver, someone who can be with him daily, not just for his physical needs, but for companionship too. You clearly have a gift with children, and Ethan trusts you. I'll cover your tuition, your living expenses, everything you need. You won't have to worry about working double shifts anymore. You can focus on your studies, on your family, and on helping Ethan." The words hung in the air. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? I'm just a waitress. You could hire anyone, nurses, professionals." "I've hired them," James interrupted gently. "I've hired the best money can buy. But none of them gave my son what you gave him in 5 minutes. Comfort, safety, joy. He trusts you. And trust, Sarah, is worth more than all the money in the world." Tears glimmered in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "I don't know what to say." "I say." "Yes," Ethan piped up suddenly, gripping her hand tightly.
"Please?"
"Sarah, be with me. I like you." Sarah looked at the boy's hopeful face, then at his father's steady gaze. She felt torn. Her heart wanted to say yes, but fear held her back. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? But then she thought of her siblings, her mother, the heavy weight she carried every day. This could change everything. Finally, her voice trembled as she spoke. "If you're sure, then yes. I'll do it," Ethan cheered, clapping his hands. James smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes, something rare for him. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly. "You've just given me more than you can imagine." That night, as Sarah walked home, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she could see a future where she didn't have to choose between her family and her dreams. And for James, sitting in his study once more, he knew his decision was right. He had found someone who could bring light not only into Ethan's life, but into his own as well. The offer had been made, and it was accepted. And though none of them could see the full picture yet, that moment marked the beginning of a bond that would change their lives forever. After Sarah accepted James's offer, life changed quickly for everyone involved. Sarah moved into a small apartment near James's mansion, with the costs for rent, utilities, and her studies all taken care of. For the first time in years, she felt a freedom she had never experienced, a freedom from constant worry, from working multiple jobs just to survive, and from the pressure of balancing school, work, and her family. She could finally focus on her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse while also spending meaningful time with Ethan. Ethan, for his part, was happier than James had ever seen him. He greeted Sarah every morning with a bright smile, his small hands reaching out for hers the moment she walked through the door. The boy's world, which had often felt limited because of his condition, suddenly expanded. He laughed more, asked more questions, and tried new activities he had previously avoided out of fear. Simple things like trying new foods or exploring. The garden behind the mansion became exciting adventures with Sarah by his side. James watched all of this quietly, sometimes from a distance, sometimes sitting with them in the garden or the living room. He realized that he had underestimated the importance of emotional connection in his son's life. Money, therapy, and top-notch equipment could do a lot, but they couldn't replace someone who genuinely cared, someone who could laugh with him, comfort him, and inspire him to try new things. Sarah had brought all of that into their lives in a way James had never anticipated. In the evenings, Sarah would help Ethan with his studies, She patiently guided him through reading, math, and even science projects about stars and planets, which fascinated him endlessly. She found ways to make learning fun, using games and hands-on activities that kept his attention and made him feel proud of himself. Ethan began to excel, not just academically, but socially and emotionally. He began to open up to James in ways he hadn't before, talking about his dreams, fears, and hopes with more confidence. James noticed the changes in his own life, too. He had always been a busy man, consumed by his work and responsibilities. But seeing Ethan so happy, so engaged, gave him a new perspective. He found himself making time to join Sarah and Ethan for meals, for garden walks, and for quiet evenings reading together. The mansion, once a silent and empty place after Ethan went to bed, now felt alive with laughter, conversation, and warmth. James realized that his wealth could provide comfort, but love, care, and attention were what truly made a house a home. Sarah's influence extended beyond just Ethan. She became a part of the Thornton household in ways that surprised even James. She suggested improvements to Ethan's routines that made his daily life easier and more enjoyable. She organized small activities like painting afternoons and music sessions that helped Ethan develop his motor skills and creativity. And in every moment, she treated Ethan not as someone who was fragile or different, but as a capable, curious child with immense potential. Outside the mansion, Sarah's life also improved. With the financial burden lifted, she could take care of her family more effectively. She helped her siblings with schoolwork, ensured her mother's health needs were met, and could even indulge in small joys she had denied herself for years. For Sarah, the offer from James had not just been a job, it had been a lifeline, a chance to rebuild her life while pursuing her dreams. As months passed, the bond between Ethan and Sarah deepened. They shared countless small moments building puzzles, reading storybooks, stargazing in the backyard. Ethan often called her my hero in his shy, innocent way, and Sarah would laugh softly, hugging him tightly. James observed all of this with a quiet satisfaction, feeling that something profound had shifted in all their lives. One afternoon, James hosted a small family gathering at the mansion. Sarah helped organize it, decorating the dining area with flowers and arranging games for the children. Guests arrived, many of them unaware of Sarah's new role, but they quickly noticed the warmth she brought into the home. Ethan proudly introduced her to everyone, talking about how she taught him about the stars, helped him with homework, and made every day fun. During the gathering, a neighbor approached James and commented on the change in Ethan. "He seems so happy these days," the neighbor said. "It's like he's blossomed." James smiled, glancing at Sarah, who was kneeling beside Ethan, helping him with a game. "He has," James replied, "and it's all thanks to her." Sarah's humility made her blush slightly, but she shook her head. "I just do what I love," she said softly. James realized that life had a way of bringing the right people at the right time. Sarah had entered their lives by chance, yet her presence had created a ripple effect of happiness, growth, and love that could not be measured by money or status. For James, it was a lesson in humility and gratitude. For Ethan, it was a doorway to a world filled with care, learning, and joy. For Sarah, it was the fulfillment of dreams she had once thought impossible. Over time, the trio became inseparable. They traveled together, exploring new places and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Even on ordinary days, the mansion was filled with laughter, storytelling, and the simple comfort of togetherness. James often reflected on that fateful day at the diner, realizing that a single moment of compassion had transformed their lives forever. Ethan grew stronger and more confident with each passing year. Under Sarah's guidance, he learned to navigate challenges with courage, to express his thoughts and feelings freely, and to embrace life with curiosity. His progress amazed doctors and therapists, who often remarked on the remarkable bond between the boy and his caregiver. Sarah's career also flourished. With her studies fully supported, she excelled in nursing school, graduating at the top of her class. She began working in pediatric care, bringing the same compassion and dedication she had shown to Ethan into the lives of countless children. She never forgot the boy who had trusted her when he needed her most, and she often visited the Thornton home now, as both friend and professional mentor. For James, watching Sarah and Ethan together was a constant reminder that wealth alone could never create happiness. It was the people around him, their love, care, and willingness to share themselves, that brought true meaning to life. And in that, he had found something more valuable than any business deal, any luxury, or any accolade of family, bound not just by blood or money, but by trust, compassion, and the shared journey of healing and growth. Years later, when people asked James about the most important decision he ever made, he didn't talk about investments or acquisitions. He spoke about the day he met Sarah, the waitress who held his son after a fall, and how that simple act of kindness had transformed all their lives. Ethan would sit beside him, laughing and sharing stories, and Sarah would smile, remembering how far they had all come together. That single day in a small diner had sparked a lifetime of change. It had created bonds that were unbreakable, brought joy where there had been worry, and opened doors that none of them could have imagined. And in the quiet moments when the mansion was still and the world outside seemed distant, James, Ethan, and Sarah would sit together, a family forged not by chance alone, but by care, trust, and the courage to step forward when it mattered most.